All right, for this review, this is a test review, or this is also a quiz review, since we have a quiz tomorrow. So we will start off with asking a few questions, whether you know how to do the following tasks. So the first thing is to ask yourself, do I know how to add vectors? Do I know how to add vectors? Meaning that if I give you a couple of ways, if I give you this, if I say, hey, everybody, if I have 2 comma negative 1 for vector v, and then 3 comma 4 as vector w, do you know how to add them together? Okay, and we'll say, yeah, the resultant vector is very easy. Yes, you may want to use a piece of paper to write this down. So one way to do this is to simply add the x components together. So the resultant will be 5 comma 3. Okay, so that's one way to add the vectors together. The other way to add the vectors together, it's that, well, if you have 2 comma negative 1, so that's your vector v, and then you would go ahead, connect to next vector right after the v in the head to tail fashion. Okay, so you remember, head to tail, and then you want to find the total, the resultant. You start from the beginning and you go to the end point. Okay, so the first 2 questions are actually the same question. If you know how to add the vectors together, then you know how to do the resultant. And again, you connect the individual vectors together if you would like to find out the resultant vector. Yes. Okay. All right. So keep that in mind. Okay. So if you have individual vectors together, just add the x components and y components together, you get the resultant. If you have the arrows, just connect them from head to tail. Okay. Now, there are a couple of more specific skills that we went over, and we hope that you can retain them and show them on the quiz tomorrow and also on the test next Monday. One thing is about if you have 2 vectors. If you have 2 vectors like the one I showed you, could you find the angle between the 2 vectors? Okay, could you find the angle between the 2 vectors? Now, what does it mean? Okay, if I say what's the angle between the vector v and vector w in this case, that means v is like this. This is v, and w is like this. Now, in this case, we are not connecting these together from head to tail because we are not finding the resultant, but rather we are finding this angle right here. What is this angle? So to find this angle, we have an equation. Do you know the equation? That starts with cosine theta equals 2. The dot product over the magnitude multiplied together. Okay, I know this is before spring break, so I just want to ask you these questions so that you know how to find them. Okay. So that's how you find them. Okay, and we will have an example on how to find them in a moment. Okay. And then, and do I know how to tell if 2 vectors are parallel or perpendicular? Well, what do we say about parallel vectors? So the parallel vectors, they are always multiples of each other. So you can have a vector A that is like 2, 3, and a parallel vector would be like 6, 9. So in this case, there will be a multiple of 3. Okay. Or the other way to look at this is that they are always proportional to each other. Okay, you put the x components over each other, you put the y components over each other. As long as you're consistent, then they should be equal. And you should expect the question where you have to find the unknown k. That will be on the quiz and test. Okay, because we want to see if you understand what it means to have a pair of parallel vectors. And for perpendicular vectors, what's the meaning of having a perpendicular vectors? Well, that's when you have a line that negative reciprocal, but with vectors, that means the dot product must equal to 0 because using the previous equation, well, if the angle it's 90 degrees, so cosine 90 is 0. So if cosine 90 is 0, the fraction is equal to 0. And if a fraction is equal to 0, it means the numerator must be 0. Okay. Now I find this logic, it's very valuable, especially if you're heading to calculus. Again, if a fraction is equal to 0, the numerator must be 0. Okay, if you can understand that logic, it helps so much in calculus. Because 0 divided by anything, it's simply 0. Okay. And then do I know how to analyze navigation related problems? Well, the main thing about navigation related problems is that do you know how to read bearings? Okay. So north, it's how many degrees? 0. And this is 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and 270 degrees. So that's really the main thing. Do you know how to make your do the direction? Okay. And then of course, one thing that shows up very consistently is that whether or not you are aware of the alternate interior angles. Okay. From the questions that we did for the past, well, yesterday and also the week before spring break, there's always a little slice of the angle that's like, oh yeah, alternate interior angles. That's 20 degrees or that's 10 degrees. We see those again. Okay. So, all right. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few questions here. So let's go ahead and look at the first question. So for the first question here,